Two Sunday pictorial representatives, Victor Thompson and Lionel Crane, yesterday spent the most amazing day in their lives. In a neat little house at Thornton Heath, they saw miracles wrought by some malevolent, ghostly force. They saw saucers held in a woman's hand exploded into smithereens by an invisible power. Eggs, saucepans, fenders, rugs, wine glasses, coal, and a score of other objects sailed through the air before them, and sometimes, apparently, right through closed doors, propelled by no human force. This dramatic description was published in the Sunday Pictorial, vividly detailing the terrifying events witnessed by reporters at the home of the Fielding family. What they saw was no ordinary haunting. This was a full-blown poltergeist case, and at the heart of it was Alma Fielding, a housewife who suddenly found herself and her family at the mercy of an unseen force that seemed intent on turning their lives upside down. In the coming months, this small suburban home would become the focus of national attention, attracting investigators, reporters, and skeptics alike. At the centre of the haunting was Alma Fielding, a 34-year-old housewife. Alma had lived a relatively quiet life up until the haunting began, but her personal health had been fragile for years. She'd been struggling with chronic kidney pain, and at the time of the haunting, she was on antibiotics and sedatives to manage her condition. Alma's husband Les was a car mechanic, and by all accounts he was a practical man and not prone to superstition, but the events in his home would soon test even his resolve. And together, Alma and Les had a 16-year-old son named Donald, who also became caught up in the terrifying experiences that would soon envelop their home. There was also a lodger in the house, a George Saunders, who had been living with the Fieldings for several years. George was a boot and shoe mender who had moved in after the breakdown of his marriage. The family lived in a modest home in Beverston Road, a house that seemed completely ordinary until early 1938, when the supernatural activity began. It all started in February of 38. At first, the disturbances were small, barely noticeable, but they quickly escalated into full-scale onslaughts that terrorised everyone in the Fielding home. The first thing that really got Alma's attention wasn't a loud noise or a dramatic event. It was a single handprint that appeared on a mirror in the home. A handprint that could not be attributed to anyone living there. The first major incident came one night when Alma and Les were in bed, Alma having taken her medicine, and on that particular night Les was in a degree of pain due to having his teeth removed in preparation for some dentures being fitted, so neither of the two was in particularly good spirits. Out of nowhere, a glass tumbler shattered on the floor, though no one had touched it. Moments later, a second glass flew across the room and smashed against the wall. This marked the beginning of a series of increasingly violent disturbances. Saucers shattered in Alma's hands, cutting her badly on one occasion. Teacups lifted from tables only to break in mid-air, as if thrown by invisible hands. Objects around the house were frequently seen flying through the air with no apparent cause. Pots and pans, eggs, rugs, coal and crockery all became weapons of the poltergeist, hurling themselves around the home, and a wine glass seemingly passed through a solid oak sideboard. Even the furniture wasn't spared. One night Donald's wardrobe tipped over and crashed right onto his bed. He wasn't in the room at the time, thankfully. On another occasion, the sideboard tipped forward as if it was about to fall, only to just pull itself back into place against the wall at the last moment. The poltergeist wasn't content with simply moving objects. It also had the power to make things appear and disappear. During a trip to Woolworths, Alma tried on a ring, but she left it in the store, only to find it mysteriously reappear on her finger later. At home, a pot of vanishing cream appeared to fall from the ceiling, conjured from nowhere, and landed on Alma's head. The Fieldings, especially Alma, became more numb to the constant chaos. Even as saucers spun in midair and chairs tipped up onto one leg, the poltergeist's once shocking and frightening displays had become a predictable part of life in the house. Alma herself was often the main focus of the poltergeist's attacks. She frequently found bruises and bite marks on her body, although there was no explanation for how they got there. On one occasion, she felt a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on her chest in the middle of the night, as if something was trying to suffocate her. The nickname Jimmy was given to the poltergeist by the Fielding family as a way to cope with the constant, unnerving activity in their home. As the disturbances became a daily occurrence, the family, particularly Alma, began to refer to the entity in almost casual terms, despite the terror it was causing. It was as if giving it a name helped to make everything a bit more normal. Jimmy did seem to communicate during séances. There were several instances where Jimmy apologised for his actions or offered explanations for various occurrences. In one instance, Jimmy expressed regret for an incident where he threw a cup and saucer across a room and smashed a plate during a visit to Rose's house. Rose Saunders was Alma Fielding's best friend and also the sister-in-law of George Saunders, the lodger living with the Fielding family. Rose was frequently involved in the events surrounding the poltergeist activity, both as a witness and as someone who experienced the manifestations directly. For example, she was present when Alma's mug of Bovril was mysteriously flung off the table, soaking Rose's coat during a visit to a cafe. Jimmy didn't speak directly in all instances. At times, other entities, such as a spirit named Bremba, would explain or speak on Jimmy's behalf during the séances. The communication often involved table tilting, with messages being spelled out through knocking, and it was Bremba who often acted as a kind of intermediary, occasionally mentioning Jimmy's involvement in various phenomena. Bremba's role was not to cause mischief, but rather to explain or offer insights into what was happening, particularly when the activity attributed to Jimmy became violent, distressing, or destructive. Bremba would often communicate during séances, helping to convey messages from the poltergeist and occasionally apologising for his behaviour. According to a psychic medium that Alma visited, Bremba was described as a Persian artist who was trying to make contact with Alma from the spiritual realm. During the séances that took place later at the International Institute for Psychical Research, Bremba communicated through Alma while she was in a trance, speaking in a low voice and identifying himself. This guide seemed protective of Alma, warning the investigators about overworking her, stating that her body was too weak to continue with certain experiments, warning them against pushing Alma too hard, particularly in tests involving astral projection, warning that the strain could be dangerous to her health. In the context of Alma's psychic experiences, Bremba's presence was seen as a counterbalance to the more chaotic poltergeist activity associated with Jimmy, providing a guidance and sometimes calming the disturbances. The escalating activity soon attracted the attention of paranormal investigators and, most notably, Nandor Fodor, a Hungarian-born psychical researcher and psychoanalyst working with the International Institute for Psychical Research. Fodor approached the case not just as a paranormal mystery, but as a psychological puzzle. Fodor set about investigating Alma's case with a series of tests and experiments attempting to separate genuine phenomena from trickery. He placed Alma in a sealed glass cabinet under strict observation. Even in this controlled environment, the poltergeist seemed to strike. Objects would move around the room and a bottle of smelling salts appeared in Alma's hand, even though she'd been searched beforehand. Fodor arranged for Alma to undergo some X-ray examinations to rule out fraud. These revealed that she had been concealing small objects on her person, which cast doubt on some of the more dramatic phenomena. However, Fodor believed that Alma's case wasn't just a hoax. He theorized that her emotional and physical distress could be unconsciously driving the poltergeist activity. Fodor's psychoanalytic approach led him to consider whether Alma's chronic illness, combined with the effects of antibiotics and sedatives, might have affected her mental state, causing her to project her inner turmoil outward in the form of psychic energy. Fodor did suspect that Alma Fielding had faked some aspects of the poltergeist activity, not all of them. He noted that she seemed to anticipate the poltergeist activity in ways that suggested she might have been manipulating the phenomena. For example, she seemed to have knowledge of where objects would appear or how they would move, which cast doubt on some of the spontaneity of the occurrences. His findings, obviously, complicated the case because he believed Alma's experiences were this mix of genuine paranormal phenomena and deliberate or unconscious trickery. Lawrence Evans was Fodor's assistant, a young and keen investigator who had joined the International Institute for Psychical Research only a few months prior to the case. When Evans first visited the Fielding House on Beverston Road, he encountered several unexplained phenomena that left him both intrigued and frankly unsettled. He reported seeing objects such as wine glasses leaping from Alma's hand and shattering in mid-air before then flying across the room. During one visit, Evans heard a vase smash near a grandfather clock in the hallway. Upon investigation, he realised that the vase had been thrown from upstairs without anyone being physically present to do so. He was perplexed by how quickly and mysteriously the objects moved, leaving him convinced that something supernormal, as he called it, was at play. As with many poltergeist cases, there are multiple ways to interpret what happened to the Fielding family. Could the poltergeist have been a genuine paranormal entity, or was there something more psychological at play? One thing that doesn't get mentioned very much is Donald, the son, who is a teenager. Often in these cases of poltergeist activity, we find out pretty soon into the story that there is a teenage girl in the house, and that this poltergeist type activity seems to be attracted to them in particular. Is it the case that it's the same if there's a teenage boy in the house? There is one instance during a violent outburst from the poltergeist where coins were thrown at both Donald and the lodger George Saunders as they tried to help Alma during one of her terrifying episodes. The poltergeist seemed intent on creating havoc, and this attack on Donald and George was part of its escalating aggression. George, in fact, was present for the coal-throwing incident, and he himself witnessed heavy furniture moving on its own. One particularly eerie incident for George involved Alma standing in George's room late at night, dressed in a red dressing gown. George recalled waking up to see Alma grinning at him in a menacing manner. He shouted at her to leave, but the next day Alma had absolutely no recollection of the event, and she denied owning a red dressing gown, claiming she used to, but she'd given it away to her mother. This disturbed George, as it suggested that Alma might have been acting under the influence of some sort of spirit being. Fodor's conclusion was that Alma's chronic kidney pain, combined with the antibiotics and sedatives she was taking, could easily have influenced her mental state. He believed that Alma might have been unknowingly generating this poltergeist activity herself through telekinetic energy fueled by emotional distress. And for those who believe in the absolute supernatural element, the Alma Fielding case remains one of the most compelling examples of poltergeist activity. The sheer volume of witnesses, the violent nature of the attacks, the fact that the people involved are not actually all part of the same family, they're not all related, and the personal assaults on Alma herself suggest that the presence of a malevolent force just can't be easily dismissed. The Fielding poltergeist case lasted for about 7 months, during which time the Fielding family, along with Saunders, endured daily disturbances. From February through to the late summer of 38, the phenomena persisted. As time went on, the activity began to lose its intensity, and by August of that year, the haunting had begun to fade. The once relentless attacks became less frequent, and eventually the poltergeist ceased its activity altogether. The family was left exhausted and bewildered by the events that had unfolded in their home, and while life returned to a semblance of normality, the haunting left behind an air of mystery that would never fully be resolved. But it seems that things changed again shortly after that, and that Jimmy would start to bring Alma gifts. Here's a piece from the Daily Express of March 1948, reflecting on the case, that nicely wraps things up for us. Among the records left by Harry Price, the ghost hunter, will be the story of the suburban spectre. It was one of his most sensational cases. He ended it with the word unresolved. He began it 10 years ago. A sunny day in Beverston Road, Thornton Heath, Surrey, and a street of red brick semi-detached houses. In every house but one, women are busy polishing lino and washing and cooking. The exception was the Villa Springfield. When Price and I called there, we found Mr. Leslie Fielding, his wife Alma, their son and their lodger sitting white-faced in the parlour, too frightened to prepare a meal. "Our house is full of ghosts. Stay and you will see," they said. We did stay, and we did see. I give you my word for it. We had been in the front room only a few minutes when an egg curved through the air and smashed against the wall and slid stickily towards the floor. We locked everybody in one room and searched the house from the attic downwards. A crash from the kitchen brought us running. Fragments from a broken bowl were still spinning on the floor. 9 hours we stayed in the villa, and they were the most extraordinary hours I ever spent. I saw a vase leave the mantelpiece and go through a shut door, and when I went into the hall to track it, it was lying there in pieces. I saw a brush hurtle down the stairs and hit Mrs. Fielding in the back. Only a second before, I'd been upstairs and made sure the rooms there were empty. At tea time, Mrs. Fielding was sitting beside the fire on a low stool, and I sat on another stool opposite her. Suddenly, a cup and saucer she held in her hand burst into fragments. In the next minute, I saw a smoking piece of coal leave the fire in the grate, go across the kitchen and smash against the opposite wall. The incidents happened continuously, but as evening came on, we were startled afresh by a loud crash from one of the bedrooms. We ran upstairs to find that a double wardrobe filled with clothes had tipped forward across Mrs. Fielding's bed and smashed it. I was standing alone in the parlour with the door shut, making a phone call, and I heard a crash of glass. When I had finished, Mrs. Fielding came in and said, "Look, one of my best tumblers had just broken against the kitchen wall." She undid the sideboard beside which I had been leaning, and there were the other 5 tumblers of the set, and a ring of dust where the 6th had been standing. That was my last memory of the Villa Springfield, until I met Mrs. Fielding again in 1948, and she told me she'd stayed in the house in Thornton Heath until 1940. When she moved to a bungalow in Devon. "The spirits moved with me," she said. "They never leave me now, but they are not mischievous anymore. They do not break things. They bring me gifts instead. In the past year, they have brought me a Chinese fan and an African jungle knife. Once, when I was ill in bed, I heard money raining down on the concrete path all around the bungalow. I looked down, and there were half-crowns and 2-shilling pieces. They keep me well. They advise me. I shall never be afraid again." Living at the Villa Springfield now is Mrs. Smith. It is a highly polished and cheerful-looking house. "Ghosts?" said Mrs. Smith. "Bless your life, I never heard of any such thing."